Good morning. Hi, everyone. My name is Angelica Olstead. I will be playing some music for you this morning. This performance is a little unique. It will, excuse me, good morning. It will feature a mini meditation. I thought that might be nice to include on this Friday morning, kind of help set the tone. The piece I'm playing is titled Brave New World. I actually presented it in the last Creative Mornings event, and it was written in 2020 in the height of the pandemic when we didn't know what a brave new world was going to look like, and now we are actually living it. So the intention for today's meditation is just to think about what this brave new world looks like for you. Obviously, there is a lot of strife and conflict existing right now, and it's hard to center ourselves and find purpose and meaning. So that's the context for today's performance. So yeah, without further ado, I will start. Thank you.
Begin by closing your eyes. Bring the sits bones to the front of the chair and make sure that both feet are firmly planted into the ground, rooting yourself into the earth. Place one hand over your heart and one hand over your stomach and constrict the back of the throat. Begin deep breathing, making sure that the inhalations are matching your exhalations. Exhale, release the hands into the inner thighs and observe any feelings, positive or negative, that you may be experiencing right now. Perhaps it's discomfort sitting close to someone after being in isolation for so long. Or maybe it's something that gives you great joy that you're looking forward to. On your next breath, focus on emptying the head of all of these thoughts, good and bad, and allowing yourself literal peace of mind. You can always come back to these thoughts at a later time. Continue to breathe deeply, in and out, matching your inhalations so they match your exhalations. And on your next inhale, open the eyes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Angelica Olstead. That was Brave New World from Transmute. I am doing a new album released later this year called American. It's a reclamation identity piece on being an Asian American growing up in Colorado in the 90s. So you can look forward to that. You can follow me on the interwebs. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angelica. I admit I just got very emotional. Oversharing on stage, isn't that great? My dad passed away 6 months ago. My dad was an avid piano player, and this is the kind of music he would play in our house growing up, and I just feel like my dad is with us right now, so thank you. Well, that's not what I planned to say, but here we are. So another round of applause for Angelica. Angelica is, fun fact, she's an active community organizer, which is very much my love language. And she founded a pop-up yoga in New York City in 2011, which I find really, really cool. Like, there's more info on Angelica in our follow-up email, and there's also going to be a chance for you to make a donation if you want, if you feel so inclined. But thank you, Angelica, for opening our event today. Also, we are always looking for musicians to open our events. If you know anyone, or if you want to nudge your friend who should do so, in the follow-up email there's going to be a link where you can fill up a form, or you can grab Casey right there with the red jacket and you can tell her afterwards. All right, good morning. My name is Tina Roth-Eisenberg. I'm the founder of Creative Mornings and your New York City host, and I want to not only welcome the people in the room here, but also the people on our live stream, which I'm really proud. I just saw all the camera angles that we have. We have a super pro live stream. Look at us coming out of the pandemic strong with actually making this possible for people who can't be here, which, so I want to say hi to all the live stream people. But I must say, it's really emotional to be meeting up in person again. This is our second only IRL event since the pandemic. And it just feels so good to see all of your faces again and to be in community. It's been a really hard 2 years, I don't want to lie, for a face-to-face community. But if I've learned one thing these 2 years is that our community is so incredibly resilient, and what they want to do is meet up, be it virtual, be it in a real life, it doesn't matter. So we're glad you're still coming out to us. And I must say, like, I'm extra grateful that we can ease back into hosting events again, because I admit, my team and I last month, we were a bit like, how do we do this again? Because we got really good at the Zoom events. We really were good at that. But the fact that we can have our first 2 events in our actual home, because fun fact, Creative Mornings HQ is actually on the 3rd floor here. It's just really extra special. And I want to make an extra heartfelt shout out for Lucien, who is the reason why this building is this magical building that it is. Lucien is, Lucien had a vision like many, many years ago when he walked by this building and he was boarded up for what it could be and turned it into like an artistic, creative hub. There's artists up here. This is an exhibition space. You can rent this space. And as I said, Creative Mornings is on the 3rd floor too. And I just want to point out 2 exhibitions that are currently going on here. Make sure before you leave to check out this sculpture in the garden. It's actually a tea room. It's by a Japanese artist called Takao Shiraishi. I butchered that, I'm sorry. But anyway, check this out. And also on May 5th, there's a really cool event happening here. It's called Look and Listen. And according to the New York Times, I think this happened multiple times, they called it a winning formula of there's emerging artists, musicians performing here on May 5th. So check it out on the Invisible Dog website, which is going to be in the follow-up email. So thank you, Lucien and Arlie, for so generously hosting us. All right. Every month we read the manifesto, the Creative Manifesto, because it kind of sets the tone and sort of reminds us all why we're gathering here as a community. And we always have someone special read it, and this month we have our brand new COO, Patrick, actually read it. And fun story is Patrick came to us first. We met Patrick and then became fast friends because he was working at Harvest, who is also, fun fact, our local partner. So that's how we met Patrick. He came in as a partner, and then he started volunteering and became our chief community officer. He's probably poured some of you coffee before. And then when we were looking for a COO, I was kind of like, Patrick, wouldn't that be great for you? So here he is. So a round of applause for Patrick.
Hello, good morning. Everyone is creative. A creative life requires bravery and action, honesty and hard work. We are here to support you, celebrate with you, and encourage you to make the things you love. We believe in the power of community. We believe in giving a damn. We believe in face-to-face connections, in learning from others, in hugs and high fives. We bring together people who are driven by passion and purpose, confident that they will inspire one another and inspire change in neighborhoods and cities around the world. Everyone is welcome.
Thank you. All right, raise of hands. Like, who is here for the very first time? You're so welcome here. I actually will give you a hug afterwards if you want to. I know this is very controversial now that we are in the times we're in, but I will hug you if you want it. And we're so happy that you found us. First-timers often actually don't know that we're happening not just in New York, even though we started here, but we're actually happening in 67 countries in 224 cities every month, which blows my mind on a regular basis. And what is really wild is that we grew during the pandemic. There were people who were like, I know we can only do it in Zoom, but we still want to start a chapter. To me, that's just like the most heart-opening thing ever. And some of the newest chapters are Shiraz, Novosibirsk, Ribeirão Preto, Klaipeda, Bodrum, Amritsar. And I admit, oftentimes I have to literally Google where these places are when we get applications. It's a little bit of a geography class running Creative Mornings. And it's a true testament to the resilience of this community that we have grown. And speaking of resilience, I just want to take a moment and just really send love to our Ukraine chapters. We actually have 3 in Ukraine, in Kyiv, Lviv, and Odessa. Our hearts are really going out to our volunteer teams out there. It's just of unspeakable magnitude what is happening. And last month, we kind of pointed out the organizations that they asked us to share with you for possible donations. And this month, we want to just give you the opportunity, if you at all feel like you want to send them something, like a word of encouragement, a poem, a video, a piece of art, whatever it is. In our follow-up email, there will be a way for you to contribute something, because we're going to send them what we call a digital care package, but also in the Belarus and Russian chapters as well. We want to include the countries around it. And that was actually an idea that came from our host in Vancouver and in Guadalajara. Like, we're like, what can we do as a global organization just to at least send some love in some way? So feel free to contribute, because you see it in the follow-up email. And yeah, so we're happening around the world, and oftentimes people just look at me and they're like, how? How is this thing even possible? It's free, it's around the world. And I always have to say it's because we have some really, really generous companies out there that just believe in the creative community meeting up. They believe in giving a damn. And they're the ones that, by sponsoring this, make this happen. And I just want to give them a shout out. Our local one, our local partner, like the reason why you have free coffee and breakfast is because Harvest is supporting us. They are our favorite time tracking software. They're also a New York City-based company. And they just got a brand refresh, which they're really excited about, and I am excited for them. So check it out if you're at all into the world of time tracking. They have made something really painful actually really pleasant and easy. And then we have global partners, global partner, MailChimp. They have been supporting us. Anyone who's been to these, they're like, oh my God, Tina, you're so cute. You're 13 and a half years in thanking MailChimp on stage. They have been supporting us since we were 1 chapter. And we've grown alongside. They're just a magical organization, and they really believe in Creative Mornings. And they've started as an email platform, and now they're a full-fledged marketing platform. They're really big and still wonderful humans. And they just came out with a really cool series in collaboration with It's Nice Dad It's called The Movers and Makers. It's going to be in the follow-up email. It's really wonderful articles where they spotlight creatives and their stories and strategies, how they, the secrets behind their business growth. It's really interesting. So thank you, MailChimp. All right. So now one of my favorite things, the GIF is not going. Hold on. There we go. So, when we had to move everything to Zoom, we couldn't just take what this is and move it to Zoom. We had to sort of reinvent how do we translate what Creative Mornings feels like to Zoom? And now we came back to this and it was like, wait, but there's things that we've done on Zoom, that we can't take the other way around. So this is one of the things that we couldn't take to Zoom. And I am so happy we can do it again. And that's a real lead, this lead up was a bit extreme, but it's the stand-up if. I just love my stand-up if. So here, it's very simple. If you can stand up and if you want, if you can't, it's fine. I'm going to make statements on the screen, and I ask you to stand up if if you agree with the statement. All right. Stand up if you attended last month's event, or raise your arm. You are the OG regulars again for post-pandemic, so I congratulate you. Thank you. Stand up if you're for hire. Stand up. What kind of roles are you looking for? Shout it out. Okay. All right, for those of you hiring, remember who's standing. Cool. Also, we have a job board, by the way. Stand up if you're in love. One day we're all standing, right? That's my goal. Stand up if you're contemplating a really big life change. Oh my God, somebody is like raising his arms back there. All of you life changers, look at each other, talk to each other afterwards, okay? All right, and now a very timely one. Stand up if you're excited that for the first time in US history, white men won't make up the majority in Supreme Court. Hooray, Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm so happy for her. All right, thank you for humoring me here. And stand up if you hope to make new friends. Just make sure to not leave right away and talk to each other. You all want to make new friends. All right, speaking of making new friends, one of my favorite things I do leading up to these events is to go see who's attending. If you don't know this, but on the event page, you can actually go to see who's attending. And I love nothing more than clicking through your faces and your profiles and learning about you, because on the profiles, we ask really fun questions. So I just want to say, you're a really good looking bunch. If your profile doesn't have a photo, put one up. It's really worth it because people can actually find, like, if you met someone interesting, like for those of you who are not in love right now, but you want to be in love, if you met someone but they can't find you because your profile doesn't have a photo, it's not helping. Moving on. Okay, April's theme is Kismet. It was chosen by the Istanbul chapter, and it was illustrated by Celine Sinar. And MailChimp is our presenting partner around the world for this theme. And now, I am so incredibly excited to introduce Giles Duly. He is London-based, so we're extra lucky that we have him here. He's a storyteller documenting the long-term impact of war. Giles was supposed to speak here exactly 2 years ago on April 6th. We had the event page ready to go, and then the world stopped. But now 2 years later, he's here, and we're still making it happen, and it's probably more timely than ever what he has to share with us. I had the pleasure to meet Giles in 2018 at a small, beautiful conference in Wales called the Do Lectures. And I've been really lucky to attend a lot of conferences in my life, but I have never been as touched by a speaker as I was with Giles. And I was lucky to get to know Giles a little bit afterwards and talk to him. So to me, it's a real gift that he's here and sharing his storytelling magic with us. In this talk, he said one thing, and I can't hold on. Oh, nope, that's not what I want to do. I lost a mouse. Anyway, he said one thing that I remember, and I took with me from his talk. It was along the lines of that everyone in us has the ability to create change, and that everyone in us has the ability to spark the ability to make change in others. And it so resonated with me because I'm a big believer that we are all here on earth for one reason, and that is to leave it a little bit better, whatever that means for you and what you can do. And to me, it's all about helping people to move out of fear into love. And I think Giles is doing this with his work on so many levels, and I want you to give a huge round of applause for Giles.
That photo is my crazy lockdown photo. That was taken, I was like locked down on my own, and one of my friends kind of passing by, that's me staring madly out, saying, please talk to me. You know, I really understood like dogs, how dogs get so excited when the postman comes. You know, after like 2 months of being on your own, you'd see the postman coming, you'd be like, hello, hello. Just gonna, okay. Kismet, fate. I was thinking about it the other night, and I'm going to share 3 stories. 3 stories of people whose lives have been shaped by Kismet. But really it's about how they coped with it, how they adapted. One story is about love. One story is about stubbornness. And one story is about forgiveness. I'm going to start the first one in Lebanon in 2014. I'll mention it a bit later, but I was injured myself in Afghanistan in 2011. It was a long recovery before I could work again. One of the first stories I did when I could travel again independently was to go to Lebanon to document some of Syria's most vulnerable refugees, single-parent families, the elderly, and those living with war injuries like myself. People like Khulud. Khulud had been at home in Syria when a sniper shot her in the neck. She was actually in the garden, growing vegetables. She fell on top of one of her own children. Her family managed to get her emergency medical treatment, and then they escaped into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where I met her. She was living in a homemade tent, a tent made of bits of plastic, cardboard, even posters ripped down from billboards. Imagine a tetraplegic woman living in a homemade tent. Her only support came from her husband, Jamal, who was her full-time carer. The children slept on the floor by the bed. She had no dignity, no privacy. It was a really desperate situation. I remember asking Khulud, what's your one hope for the future? And she said, Giles, I just want to be a mother again. She would describe how if one of her children fell over and scratched his knee, and he would run in, and like any child would say, make it better, mummy, but she couldn't lift her hand to even put it on the wound. On this trip, I also met Reem. Reem had been at home in Syria when a rocket hit her house. She was lying in bed. Her husband was killed in the bed next to her. She lost her leg. One of her children died that night as well. When I met her, she was living on the top floor of an unfinished building in Lebanon. Because of her prosthetic leg, she couldn't even get up and down the stairs. She didn't want her other children living with her because she felt ashamed that she couldn't be a proper mother to them. The only person that lived with her was her father, Ahmed. Now, if you go online, you will see I love to take portraits with this white bedsheet. It's the most well-traveled bedsheet in the world. But what it does for me is it takes people away from the circumstance and focuses just on them, and many times gives them back that dignity. But I always like to take pictures of people looking directly at my camera. Now, on this rooftop, I was really struggling because every time I was about to take a picture, Ahmed would look away. And I kept saying, no, look at me, and go to take the picture, and he would look away. And eventually I had to say, look, why do you keep looking away? And he said, Giles, I'm an old man. He says, you see in the distance those mountains? I said, yes. He said, that is Syria. I will probably never return home there. So I live on this rooftop, so the first thing I see in the morning and the last thing I see when I go to bed is my homeland. So I decided, in fact, in this picture, to let him look that way, because in this photograph, he is looking to home. On this trip, I also met a young girl called Aya. Now, I don't like to portray people as victims, but often they are victims of circumstance. But I don't like to show people in particularly vulnerable positions. With Aya, I was really struggling. She was 4 years old at the time. She had spina bifida, meaning she's paralyzed from the waist down. She was in this very muddy, wet tent. And I thought, if I take this photograph, it would just show her as a victim. So I said to the family instead, I'm just going to hang out for the day. We're not going to make any photographs. Now, not for the first time in my life, I was completely and utterly wrong. This young girl called Aya, she definitely was not a victim. In fact, she was the feistiest 4-year-old I've ever met in my life. And very soon I discovered she didn't just run her family, she ran the whole refugee camp. Her sister Aman walked in. Aman was about 11. Aya looked up at her and just said, "Hey, donkey, pick me up." Aman picked her up. We started walking around the camp. There'd be somebody selling bread. She'd be like, "Hey, donkey, give me the bread." They would. We'd pass somebody selling water. "Hey, donkey, give me water." They would. So eventually, actually, after several visits, I was able to take this picture of Aya playing hopscotch with her sister. Because, as I say, I traveled to some of the worst places you can imagine. But I find love, laughter, humanity in these places, and that's what I choose to reflect. And this is Aya, as I say, who is so full of life despite those circumstances. Now, I came back from this trip. As I said, this was early on in my own recovery. So it was the first time I'd really done a full assignment. My work was published around the world. I was feeling very pleased with myself. Things started picking up generally for me. It was been very hard to get my life back. And about 2 years later, I got a phone call from the UNHCR, the refugee agency. Now, as creative people, you're going to be very jealous of me now, because I got given probably the greatest brief, the greatest assignment ever given to a creative or a photographer. Now, you can imagine this was a year-long project, huge budget, traveling around the world. Normally, you get pages of notes. My assignment came as an email after lots of meetings. I opened the email, and it was just one sentence. The project was simple as this. They said, "Giles, follow your heart." And that's what I did for a year. I documented scenes that sadly we're too familiar with in places such as Lesbos in Greece, or boats. But I knew if I was going to really fulfill that brief and follow my heart, I would have to go back to Lebanon and find some of those families that I documented 2 years before. So I went back there in 2016 and revisited a lot of families. Now, I always try and take photographs back with me. I think it's important to show people how I represent them. But for somebody with no legs and one arm, taking photographic prints halfway around the world is a pain in the ass. And I get there and I give Ahmed his photograph. He looked at it. You know, this photograph with this beautiful story. He looked at me and he just said, "Giles, you made me look really old in this." I was like, well, there's gratitude for you. But, you know, life had got back to some kind of normalcy for Reem and her family. On the rooftop, she now had a daughter, a brother-in-law living with her. As always, food. But, of course, for these families, there is no normalcy. They are stuck in limbo. This is Sarah, Reem's daughter. And like with many kids, you know, you ask, "What's your favorite subject at school? Tell me about your friends." He said, "Well, I have no school and I have no friends. I live on this rooftop." And that is the reality for refugee families. They are stuck in a limbo. Of course, I managed to track down Aya and her family. They were now living in these unfinished buildings in the north of Lebanon. Aya, as feisty as ever. This is her being pushed by her brother. She was screaming, "Faster, donkey, faster." But again, like Reem's family, the parents aren't legally allowed to work. They can't take Aya to hospital if she's sick. And the children aren't able to attend school. Now, I said I managed to track down a lot of the families, but obviously some had moved. Some had changed phone numbers. On the last day I was supposed to be there, I get a phone call. It's from Jamal, the husband of Khaloud, and a phone call that I never forget. He said, "Giles, we're here back in Lebanon. We'd love to see you." I said, "Amazing, great, where are you now?" He said, "We're in the same tent you last saw us." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I felt physically sick. I repeated the question. I said, "Yeah, but where are you now?" And he said, "That same place." Now, of all the people I'd met 2 years before, nobody was in more desperate need of help than Khaloud. Those pictures have been published around the world. I thought surely something would have changed for them. Charities use those pictures. Newspapers use those pictures. I hadn't even thought to look for them there, because in my mind, there was no chance they could be there anymore. I went there the next day. I walked into the tent. I saw Khaloud on that same bed she'd not moved from in 2 years, with no windows. She'd not seen daylight. And I burst into tears, and I said, "I failed you." Now, Khaloud is like an angel. She just smiles, and she said, "No, it's okay. We knew you'd come back." Funny enough, actually, she often uses the word gizma, fate. She goes, we know it's your fate that you would come back to us. So I said, there's only one thing I can do, and that's to do my work better. So over the next week, I photographed everything in this tent, the daily life. Now, imagine Jamal. This is like a little kitchen on the side of the tent. He's a great cook. He has lost everything. He's lost many family members. He's lost his home. He's lost his career, his life in Syria. Do you wonder what his greatest fear is? He whispers to me in the kitchen. He goes, Giles, my greatest fear? My greatest fear is that Khulud does not love me as much as I love her. And that's the thing, that this tent, despite all their suffering, is a place of hope and love. It's hard to explain, but you feel uplifted after you visited them. On the last day, I was there, and I had a really difficult decision to make. Because in my bag, I had the photograph that I had taken 2 years before. But as I looked in front of me, I was looking at this scene and realized nothing had changed. It was almost an identical photograph. And I thought, if I give them this photograph, won't it remind them that nothing has changed? Won't it remind them that their fate is to be stuck in this place? But I thought, no, I have to give it to them. So I reached into my bag, and I took out the photograph, and I handed it to Khulud, this photograph that I'd taken 2 years before. But before I gave it to her, I looked and I said, when I took this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a refugee. When I made this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a woman living with a disability. When I took this photograph, I was taking a photograph of a couple who are so in love with each other. And this is a photograph of love. And that's the moment I realized I'm not a war photographer. I traveled to some of the worst places you can imagine. But what do I see there? A grandmother brushing her granddaughter's hair, a mother feeding a baby, a father on the floor doing lessons with his kids, a couple like Khulud and Jamal, looking into each other's eyes and dreaming of a different future. And that is what I photograph. And that's the amazing thing about Khulud and Jamal, is their love. Their love has overcome everything that fate has given them. I came back and actually did a crowdfunding campaign with the actor Misha Collins, who's a friend, and his amazing Gish community. I know some of them are watching online today. And we managed to raise $250,000 in the space of a couple of weeks. Why? Because of love. Because we just shared that story of love. And we were able to rehouse the family. This is them when they moved into their new place in Lebanon. I should actually say it was quite funny. So I've got to know this family really well. They're very, very close friends now. But on this particular day, they just moved into the new place. I was away somewhere else, and so we did a Zoom chat. And this was a still from that Zoom chat. The reason Jamal is looking at me like that is Khulud had just said, I think I love Giles more than you now. So he's giving me this look, which is like, But the point is, thanks to the support of other people, we were able to give her her dignity back. And I remember her saying to me on this day, she goes, thank you, because I feel like I am a mother to my children again. The next story is my own story. I'm going to touch on it briefly. In 2011, I was working in Afghanistan, documenting the impact of war on civilians, when I stepped on an IED, an improvised explosive device, a landmine. I won't spend too much talking about that day, other than to say this was taken moments afterwards. I lost both my legs, my arm. I thought these would be the last moments of my life. I was picked up by an American medevac helicopter. They got me back to Kandahar, and then I was flown back to the United Kingdom, to a hospital there. But rather than that day, I want to try and help you understand what happened next. I want you to shut your eyes and imagine this. 3 days after my injury, I regained consciousness. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. I was strapped to the bed. I tried to move my remaining hand, but it was in a plaster cast, so I couldn't move my fingers. I realized even my head was strapped to the bed, so I couldn't move it. I wanted to scream, but as I tried to open my mouth, I realized that there were tubes in my nose, in my mouth, and into my throat. I couldn't speak. I wanted to do anything. Even going to the toilet was done out of my control. I realized the only thing I could do was blink. I was in an intensive care unit where people are rushing around, where the lights don't go off, it's nonstop. For 46 days, all I could do was blink. In fact, for 2 days, nobody realized I'd regained my consciousness. I was just blinking, and nobody even realized. Eventually, I was able to communicate in very small ways. But essentially, I was locked down in my own mind. We have all dealt with lockdowns recently. I call this the ultimate lockdown. Imagine lying there for 46 days, only able to communicate by blinking. Now, I knew I was going to have to create a world in my mind to keep my sanity. So I actually started thinking of creative projects. One of my favorites was called 100 Portraits Before I Die. I imagined 100 portraits that I wished I'd done. I should say I made this list when I was on very heavy doses of morphine. So I think even Big Bird from Sesame Street made it onto the list. It was quite an eclectic list of people. But I would imagine these portraits, and I would imagine meeting the person. I would imagine how we set up the shoot, how I lit it, if it was in the studio, black and white, color. I would see everything, visualize every moment. I had no idea of time, as there was no clocks, no windows, but I knew the nurses came at regular intervals to take my vital signs, and that was my unit of time. And so I would do each one of these portraits in one of these units. And I would even see the finished photograph. And I would critique it and think, how can I do something differently? And you know what's amazing? Is if I look at the way I worked as a photographer before my injury and now, I changed everything. From the cameras I used, the lighting, my techniques, the way I talk to people. And that is the amazing thing of a creative mind, is that even when we are locked down to the ultimate extreme of not being able to communicate with the world, we can improve ourselves as artists and people simply through our imagination. And that is the wonderful thing, the wonderful gift and skill that we all have within us that we can use no matter how difficult things are. About 3 months after my injury, I was well enough to be moved to have a shower for the first time. I was wheeled in to have a shower, and I saw myself in a mirror. And I was repulsed by what I saw, the missing limbs, the scars across my body. I was sickened by seeing myself in the mirror. I felt physically sick. When they put me back to bed, I cried myself to sleep, and I remember thinking, I wished I'd just died in the helicopter in Afghanistan, because I did not want this new reality. I was not brave enough, not strong enough. I could not cope with it. But the next morning, I am notoriously stubborn, and the stubbornness had kicked in with a vengeance. And I woke up the next day with a mantra that has stuck with me ever since. And I think a mantra that, for all of us, is something to live by. I woke up the next day, and I said, from this moment on, I will never think about the things I can't do, but I will focus on what I can and excel at those things. And that was the decision I made that changed everything in my life. If I was to ask most people in this room, what is bothering you the most today? Most of you would reply about something you have no control over. Whether it be the war in Ukraine, the person you work with that you can't stand with, whatever it may be. Now, those things should always be in the periphery of our vision. Of course, they inform our decisions. But focus on the things you can control each day. And through that comes power. Now, the first thing I decided I had to do with this kind of newfound wisdom was to confront the way I saw myself. And again, this is the wonderful thing about being creative, is you can find a way to do it. I decided to do a self-portrait. Now, I'd been in the British Museum just before I got injured. And in the British Museum, there's beautiful Roman and Greek statues. And most of them are missing parts. But what do you see in them? I remember the beauty that I'd seen. And so I wanted to do a self-portrait in that way. And so I went to, my friend came and sort of broke me out of hospital, pulled out all these tubes. We went to his photographic studio, possibly went via a bar. But I did this self-portrait. And this was the moment I took control of my life, because I took control of my own fate again, my own story. This was the moment I said, you know what, I actually don't care when you look at me what you think, because what's important is what I think. And I knew that I may be missing limbs, but when I made this photograph, I was a stronger man than I'd ever been. I was more focused than I'd ever been. And in fact, I was a better man than I'd ever been. And when I made this self-portrait, that was what was important to me. Now, I know I haven't got much time, but I'm going to move on to the next thing. I don't think Tina's going to drag me off stage. Especially when there's a live stream, it never looks good, right? I want to tell you another brief story, a story about an amazing woman called Olive. This is Olive, another very, very dear friend of mine. Olive has one of the most remarkable stories I know of. She was close to giving birth when, in 1994, the genocide in Rwanda happened. She is Tutsi, and she'd gone with her best friend, who was Hutu, to the hospital to give birth. As she was lying in the hospital bed, she heard over the news the story of the president being assassinated and the start of the genocide. Her friend, Clementine, said, I'm going to go home, make sure everyone's okay, you stay here. Literally, in the moment that Olive gave birth to her third child, she was about 21, I think, at the time, her village was attacked. As she gave birth, her 2 children were killed, her husband, her parents, her brothers, her sisters, every living member of her family was slaughtered. She heard about it a couple of days later. By that time, there were militias outside the hospital, and they were saying to the nurses that ran it, you have to bring out all the Tutsis so we can kill them. Eventually, they came in and started dragging everyone away. Olive made a decision that she says she regrets, but she chose to leave her baby behind because the baby had no identity, no papers, and so she was thought maybe people will think it's Hutu or Tutsi, they won't know. She was taken to a market where 2,000 people were killed. She was one of only 3 survivors. She survived by hiding under the other bodies. Eventually, she escaped to a river where she hid, and she spent the next 100 days in the river. She would spend the whole day in the water and at night sleep on the side. By the time the area was liberated at the end of the genocide, she was so sick from malaria, she could never have children again. Insects had burrowed into her skin. She was on the point of death. She was taken to hospital where she spent 3 months. When she came out of hospital, she decided the only thing she could do was to go back to her village and bury her family. But when she got there, nobody knew where the bodies were. Nobody knew what had happened to them. She didn't know, but she was suffering from PTSD, from survivor guilt, and many other things. What she did find was 6 babies that had been were now orphans. She adopted them. She moved back to the capital, Kigali, and she worked as a prostitute there. In her own words, she said she felt like a dustbin, like worthless. She said that every man that had sex with her reminded her of the killers of her family, and she deserved it. For 6 years, this is how she lived her life. Eventually, an NGO started talking to her, giving her psychological support. They taught her that it was not her fault, that she should not be angry with herself. And Olive is a remarkable woman. She's full of life and energy, and so she started to think, how can I rebuild my life? And she decided she was going to take these children, who are now 6, 7, 8 years old, and she was going to move back to her former village. So she moved back there, and she was determined to build a new life. But everywhere she looked, she saw the perpetrators of the crimes against her family. Many of them had been released. Many of them had had amnesty. So she would see the killers every day as she walked to the school, to the market, and she said she couldn't live with it. And then she made a remarkable decision. She decided for her children and for herself to move forward, she would have to forgive them all. So one by one, she would visit them, and she would say, I forgive you. Now, forgiveness is a really interesting word. What does forgiveness mean? In this context for me, she was releasing herself from the harm that they had done to her. She would find bits had been repaired in her house. She would come back and find the garden had been dug up, or there were new tiles on the roof. And obviously these people had been trying to get their own forgiveness by doing these things. But on one night, there was a knock on her door, and she opened it, and it had been the leader of the militia that had ordered the killing of her family. She was terrified. Maybe he'd come to silence her. But he stood there and he said, I've heard what you're doing. I want to take you to where we buried your family. It was now over a decade since the genocide, and he took her to an unmarked grave where over 150 bodies were discovered by the government. In Olive's own words, she said, by my forgiveness, the whole village was able to lay their ghosts to rest. She, as I say, is a remarkable woman, and that forgiveness, as I say, was what released her from her fate, from her kismet, the things that happened to her, and she was able to move forward with her life. This is her very recently with one of her adopted children. But there's actually another little twist to her story, that when she was working in Kigali, in the sex world, and forced to be a prostitute, there was a knock on her door about 5 years after the genocide. When she opened the door, it was Clementine, her neighbor. She had escaped as a Hutu. After the genocide, she'd escaped to Congo. But she said, "I've come back because I heard you're alive. I thought you'd been killed." And they hugged, they embraced, and they were both saying, it was nothing to do with you being Hutu or Tutsi. We loved each other. It was just that the world had pushed us apart. And then Clementine said, "But the reason I had to find you is because I have your baby." And she had gone to the hospital, and she had picked up Jonathan, and they had brought him up as their own until they found that Olive was alive and returned Jonathan to her. Jonathan's now in his 20s. He's just finished at university, doing incredibly well. And what we were able to do, I have a small organization, and so I said to Olive, "How can we help you?" And she said, "Well, we grow potatoes in this field. We get virtually no money for it. We get nothing. It's hard living. If you can support us in some way." And so we came up with a project called Land for Women, which is a really simple concept where we buy cooperative farms, we set them up, and we give the land to the women so they have ownership. So unlike other NGOs, the power dynamic has completely changed. And because the women own the land, they can choose to work with us. And I wanted to share that final bit of the story because, at times like this, it's hard to see hope when there's problems around the world and everything going on. But I do believe, on a personal level, as Tina said earlier, each one of us has the power to create change. Each one of us in this room has a skill, something we can use. I used to be a fashion photographer. What are the chances of a fashion photographer going out in the world and making a difference? I love fashion. I loved everything I was involved with, but I wanted to create change. I wish I was a doctor. I'm not. I wish I had the money to do things. I don't. But I can tell stories. And somebody came to an exhibition once, and they said, "Do you think you can change the world with your photographs?" I said, "No. But I believe I can inspire the person that can." And so the final picture I just want to show you is of one of the women on the Land for Women project in Rwanda. They call it Paradise. This was the first farm that we set up. And this just shows what we can do when we come together. I'm a storyteller. Again, working with Misha Collins and Gish, we were able to raise the money to set up these first farms. We now have other donors, and the project grows. And so it just shows that even through a story of love and hope, we can create real change. Thank you.
Giles, this is maybe the third standing ovation in 13 years of CreativeMornings New York history. Maybe the second.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, to a guy with no legs and one hand, standing and clapping, it's like, rub it in, why don't you, Two things I can't do.
Always touching my heart, Giles. We're going to do some Q&A. Do you want to do Q&A? Raise your hand if you want to do Q&A. Okay, so raise your hand if you have a question for Giles.
I really enjoyed your presentation. It's very inspirational. What do you think about Ukraine right now? What are your thoughts about that in the refugee crisis? And it's sort of a two-part question. The second part is don't you find that with Europe as well as the United States right now, we're all deeply touched by Ukraine, but there's a certain hypocrisy about our energy policy with regard to there's over $1.5 billion a day going into Russia. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about how we solve the problem and where it's going to end up.
Big question. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I've been documenting the conflict in Donbass since 2015. And last year I actually made a film about the region saying that I thought this was about to happen. So first off, what I would say is the fault of the West is not necessarily what's happening now, but the fact that for 7 years they have not dealt with the problem in Donbass. we have to remember like over 10,000 people were killed in that area during the conflict, and most people didn't even know that was going on. So that was, obviously there's earlier causes. I've been documenting the crisis in Syria, in many other places, which have been the impact of Putin's policies. So what we're seeing is just an extension of that, because he was never held back it before. So obviously the situation is desperate now. I don't think, unfortunately, sanctions are going to stop Putin. I met one of the Russian foreign ministers a few years ago, and I remember him saying to me about Syria, because the thing about Putin is that his whole reason there, everything about him is about this kind of macho figure, so he can never back down. So unfortunately in Ukraine, there is no way that he can back down. So the only way he can be stopped is by being defeated. He's never going to kind of pull back and say, I made a mistake, or because he loses his job. And I could talk a lot about the whole Putin backstory. The sanctions in terms of oil, that has to be brought in because it is directly funding what he's doing, without question. I think that's where we as citizens have to make our leaders more aware that we are prepared to put up with those sacrifices, because that's the reason why our leadership is not putting those sanctions on, because they know that it's going to be, especially in Europe, it is going to cause a lot of financial problems for a lot of people. So therefore, as politicians, always their desire to win and get votes means that they won't do it because they're worried that the backlash against them is going to be huge. So the only way that will change is when citizens stand up and say, I am prepared to take a hit myself, I'm prepared to put up with this in order for this to stop, because it is the only way. Because the other sanctions, to be honest, have very little effect on Putin, certainly won't stop him, because all the funding comes through the oil and gas, especially in Europe. So, yeah, I mean, it's a desperate situation. I see it as a continuation of what I've been documenting for 15 years, from Grozny all the way through Syria to what's happening in Ukraine. And as I say, I was working in Donbass just last year and could see what was happening. My NGO, we're doing small things. We just sent 300 wheelchairs. We're working with disability groups within Ukraine. We just bought 2 ambulances yesterday, and I'm going back there next week to carry on my work there within the country. But yeah, it's a terrible situation that's happened. I'm not doing this as a plug, but as something that is of interest. But I made a TV series for Vice about food. As my other passion is I'm a chef. So, but the series is about food, and we did one in Ukraine. And you can find it on YouTube, and it's just powerful to watch because it's about shared meals. And you see me sharing meals with soldiers and people. 3 of them, people in the film, are dead already. It's a very hard thing to watch now, but what you see is everyone just talking about how they wanted peace in that region, and what's been going on, and hopefully explaining the situation a little bit about why this is something that's been going on since 1930, is the Russians trying to silence Ukraine, and the genocide started in 1930. This is a continuation of it.
Hi, Giles. Thank you so much. I'm Catherine. We've met before at UNHCR. I wanted to ask you, you've dedicated your life, your career's work to centering humans, not necessarily calling them refugees, but, centering the dignity of humans. But you've also kind of immersed yourself in a world of trauma. And I'm curious how you handle your own well-being and handle the vicarious trauma that you are so sort of exposed to. Thanks.
I think, one of the words that I keep hearing a lot about is resilience. And, when lockdown happened 2 years ago, I had a lot of brands and individuals reach out to me and say, can you help us to be more resilient? Because I think everyone was kind of feeling we need to be more resilient. And actually my answer kind of surprised people, because I would say, actually, I don't think you can make yourself more resilient. I think resilience is the outcome of experience. And there's all these self-help books and all these things about resilience. And I said, well, actually, I believe when you're going through a really difficult time of suffering, pain, of challenges, that's like an athlete in training. And you have to find ways to get through it. And there's ways you can do that. You have to accept there's good days and bad days. I had plenty of days when I would just sit on the sofa and watch episodes of Frasier and didn't want to do anything. But we have to accept that that's part of a journey, but you have to feel positive about what happens at the end. And that's what I connect with all the stories I tell. People sometimes say to me, oh, you must have an amazing connection with the people, because they think of my injuries. And actually, most of the stories I do are not around injured people, and often it's around women who have suffered sexual violence and other things. Why we connect is because they always look at me and say, we can see you've suffered, but we can see how much you enjoy life now. And I think, going through such a difficult time has given me resilience. And that's where I bond with Olive, with Khulud, with all the people that I document, because we've been given that gift, which is to see life for its fullness and the joy. And so I'm the happiest I've been in my life. And I share it with all these amazing people. So I think the reason I'm able to deal with it is because having gone through something similar and having come out of that with this resilience. I mean, 46 days, as where I couldn't communicate. I spent a year in hospital, 37 operations. On 2 occasions, my family was called in to say goodbyes. And to this day, I still in pain every day when I walk, and it's a struggle. But I laugh more, I enjoy life more. And so when I'm in really difficult places, like when I go to Ukraine next week, I'll be seeing some tragedies and seeing my friends go through this really difficult time. But I know we will sit there and we will celebrate life as well. And so I think that's the life's gift. That's maybe Kismet, that's fate that has given me, because Kismet especially is the idea of fate for a reason. And so maybe my journey has given me the ability to be able to carry on doing the work I do.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, Giles. Really love the presentation. It touched me personally as a man who's both suffered and committed violence to other human beings many, many times. I apologize for not having my mask. I have my favorite Cuban flag mask on. Thank you for fucking that up. It's full of snot right now. But as you stated, you said that the sanctions and everything don't do nothing. And I just heard someone say today, because they were talking about boycotting a fight with a Russian fighter. And the guy said, let's not be hypocrites. If we boycotted the United States every time we occupied an area, what the hell are we going to do, right? So I got the point of that, but what do we do, right? If it's not the money, obviously you have this work that opens people's eyes and touches us in such a way. Aside from having that awareness, what do we do?
I mean, I look at it the same way environmental issues and other things that have changed, policy has changed simply because of people's voices. Everything is run by capitalism. Even in Russia, it's all about money. And, it was President Eisenhower that said it best when he finished his presidency, where he said that the greatest threat to American society was the American industrial military complex. The profit that was being made from war. I mean, Eisenhower was one of the greatest generals of all time, a military man, and even he could see that was the greatest threat. I've been reporting on Afghanistan for many years. I was there in July last year as everything collapsed. And you look at the money that was spent on that country. We could have given every single Afghan civilian $50,000 each for the cost of the war. And that's a country where the average income is about $9,000. So we could have just handed out $50,000. Now, what impact would that have had compared to bombing it for that amount of time? So, yeah, I totally agree with you. When we're talking about Ukraine and what Putin's doing, I've sat in Iraq. Over 500,000 people have died in conflicts since 9/11 that were carried out by the West. That is a reality, and we have to all bear responsibility for it and look to ways that we can end war by putting pressure on our politicians, by putting pressure on the companies that make profits from it. It's a small step, but I remember sitting in South Africa a few years ago with a lot of the guys that were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and we were discussing this, and I said, sometimes I feel completely helpless, fighting against war. What's the point? And they said, yeah, we used to sit here and feel exactly the same. But all you can do is all you can do. And that's the same for me, is like, there's no point turning away and saying, I don't think I can change anything. I will carry on telling stories, I will carry on campaigning, and I hope the next generation or the generation after that will turn to their politicians and say, you know what? I do not believe in spending this amount of money on defense every year, when what we use that money for is to kill people around the world. And we all have to look at that. We all have to turn to our leaders. Russians have to turn to Putin. We have to turn to our own leaders and say war can no longer be the solution. Don't worry. No, I got it.
Thank you, Giles. One more round of applause. Thank you, Giles. It's so inspiring to see you. It's been since 2018. How many years? I feel like I've been catapulted back to do lectures when I met you, and I was texting furiously with David, who puts on the do lectures, and we were gushing over just what an incredible human you are and how you inspire us, so thank you. I want to close out the event by thanking you again for being here and for our volunteers. We missed our volunteers so much during the Zoom days, and it's so happy to have them back. And I want to thank Yamna, Shiva, Sisi, Dalit, Liz, Melanie, and Maria for helping us welcome everyone, put out coffee. We love you so much, and these events wouldn't be possible without our volunteers. And then I want to thank Matt, who is our AV magician, and Almira, who takes the most stunning photos of our events. We all look so good. Thank you so much. And then Connie for recording this. Where's Connie right now? Where's she? Thanks to her, we can all watch these talks again, and we can share them with people. So I always say Creative Mornings is an engine of generosity. And it makes me so happy that so many people are willing to contribute their time and skills. And I'm very excited to say that we're going to be at a brand new venue next month. We're going to be at New Lab in the Navy Yard, which is super exciting. That's on May 20th, if you want to mark your calendars. And as always, I want to leave with a quote. And this quote I actually saw up in the Hudson Valley last weekend, and it's now my favorite red light. It's the only red light I ever hope is red, so I have to stop because there's some magical human that right next to the red light hung a little chalkboard. And every time I pass by there's a new quote on this chalkboard, and I just want to meet this person. I wish I could tell this person that I am actually showing a photo of his or her chalkboard right now. And the quote I read while I was standing at that red light was, "Spring is nature's way of saying let's party" by Robin Williams. And I think it's just so beautiful and so appropriate. And now we're bringing something back, that we did on Zoom, because ending Zoom calls is super awkward. And so we said, what's the Creative Mornings way of coming out of it? Who has experienced the ending of our Zooms, the Creative Morning Zooms? You know what's coming. You know what's coming. We did it last month. I was fully prepared for it to totally fail, fall flat, and be awkward, but it was not. We're going to dance out of our events because we used to do that at Zoom. So thank you for coming, and don't feel weird. It's totally cool, but we're going to dance out of this, okay? Thank you for coming. Casey, let's give it.